Okay, 10th of July, 2023, Monday. The title of this video is Self-Realization, Not Salvation. In the last video, we, among other things, discussed why blaming sin or evil on the creature, blaming the origin of sin or evil on the creature, be it Lucifer or Eve or Adam, in the ultimate sense, renders God no longer God. Because that would mean that God neither predetermined or caused evil, which means he wouldn't have foreseen it either, since foreseeing and predetermining are one and the same. So ultimately, because God foresees everything, including the existence of evil, since he foresees everything exhaustively down to the minutest detail, he therefore causes it and predetermines it from eternity past. It's not consistent or possible to claim that God has exhaustive foreknowledge, but that we still somehow have free will. And again, I'm speaking from the Abrahamic point of view, not the Dharmic point of view, obviously, because it's the Abrahamic understanding of God, which sees God as radically different, radically separate from the world that he created. So those are the Abrahamists' two unenviable choices. God is the author of sin, or if he wants to insist that the creature is the author of sin, then God can no longer be God because he is not omniscient. There is something that he is unaware of. He was unaware of sin before it happened. He wasn't expecting it. If he was expecting it, then he's the author of it. He's the cause of it. So, nevertheless, Christianity wants to insist that sin is man's fault. It was a response to a command from God which resulted in man ignoring the will of God and pursuing his own will. This resulted in God imposing a curse upon the human race and then establishing a covenant or agreement with man whereby God alone could sufficiently provide that which was needed or necessary for the salvation of man. Man became thereby incapable utterly of being redeemed on his own. So redemption or salvation is the framework within which to understand the plight of humanity in the world, according to the Abrahamic conception of things. So, I wanted to bring this up because to show that these two things are completely interconnected. The belief, the Christian explanation for how sin originated is connected, of course, with the entire history of redemption as it's understood within the Christian religion. So, if the origin of sin, if sin did not originate the way Christianity thinks it did, then the means whereby man is redeemed again, as explained or elucidated by Christianity, is also inaccurate and incorrect. So these judicial schemes that we hear about in Christianity that God uses to wipe away man's sin are completely flawed from beginning to end. And it really doesn't matter what variation on the theme you choose to go with, because in general, the system is really flawed from its foundation. So whether or not whether or not we're talking about the Protestant scheme, whereby Christ has to propitiate the Father, or whether you want to explain it in terms of expiation, where our guilt is expiated by the Father because of the work of the Son, or whether you want to think of it in an Eastern context where Jesus overcomes or conquers the power of death, which in Christianity includes the death of the body. In the end, they're all saying the same thing, in the sense that only God can do for us what we cannot do. So in that sense, they're all Calvinists, because mankind is utterly and totally helpless, apart from an outside act on the part of God. Now, what I wanted to also do was show another way in which we can demonstrate. Let's see. There are some other angles that we can kind of critique this from. We can start with Calvinism, and we can talk about Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And by Protestantism, by Calvinism, I'm kind of putting Protestantism here under the rubric of Calvinism, just for the sake of the video, because that was the background I came out of. Many evangelical Protestants, for example, believe in free will, unlike the Calvinists, but we're just going to deal with Calvinism as a category, and then we're going to move on and put Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy under the same roughly umbrella, because they admit, or they allow for a certain degree of free will. Calvinism has God predetermining all things. They're very outspoken about that. It's not something they're ashamed of. That's actually what distinguishes them from everyone else. And they're happy to say that God foreordained who would be saved and who wouldn't. And that we don't understand how that could be. We don't understand how that could be just or fair, but that is just the way things are. So from eternity past, God determined who would be in hell and who would inherit eternal life. If we were to adopt this notion and be brutally consistent with the implications of it, this means that the Incarnation would have been completely unnecessary. Because ultimately, if salvation and damnation come down to this predetermined and seemingly arbitrary fiat of God's will. Again, timelessly. Then there's nothing about the incarnation per se that is ultimately needed to bring about the reconciliation of man with God. God simply chose, for whatever reason, to use those means, but he could have simply said, I want you, and you with me in the kingdom of heaven, and these guys over here, I'm going to end up damning. In fact, he didn't even have to consign mankind to this sin nature due to the single act of disobedience on the part of one man. He could have made it to where some men were born into this world and lived sinlessly. Just as one example, there's many other schemes we could go with. Whereas other men decided to go their own way and ended up damning themselves. It wouldn't really matter how it was done, because if it all ultimately comes down simply to what it was that God wanted in the end. So all this stuff in between, the positing of, all of this theology about the Trinity and all of this philosophy about why the incarnation was necessary and why it was the only means whereby God, the creator and the creature, could somehow enter into union, again, is superfluous, because it's God's will that is ultimately determining the outcome of everything, including who's saved and who's not. And God could have done that in any number of ways. The conclusion that we just came to for Calvinism is ultimately the same for Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but we get there by a different route. So when you are acknowledging the possibility that man still has free will, albeit limited, you are allowing, you are saying that man is not totally depraved, that there is a kind of natural light that exists within man that allows him to see the light, which does not require the imposition of the grace of God. And the minute you allow for that little bit of light that doesn't require any kind of outside interference from God, you're making it possible that man can still be saved on his own merits or by his own effort. And as a result, therefore, the cross would not have been necessary. The East likes to say, yes, man has free will, but it was freedom to accept the Christian understanding of what Christ accomplished on the cross and in the resurrection for his sake. The incarnation itself was outside of man's outside of his ability to influence, and therefore ultimately salvation is still by grace. That sounds wonderful, again, until you contemplate the implication of saying that man within himself still has some natural goodness that was not ultimately expunged by Adam's disobedience. And so when man became mortal, he really did not become utterly helpless. He still had the ability to tap into something within himself in order to experience theosis and to be deified without any kind of scheme involving a human sacrifice or resurrection from the dead, which would mean that physical death would not need to have been part of the curse or part of the natural consequence of partaking of the forbidden fruit. So you can see how everything sort of starts to unravel when you take the premises of the various theologies and you extend them out as far as they can go to their logical conclusion. Where this will be leading me in the future, where this particular video will be sort of taking me as I start delving into some additional research, some of which I've already undergone, and which I'm as we speak, working through, is to take some of the best insights from critical scholars, biblical scholars, and show what's going on with the texts and why the text cannot be relied on to be telling us an accurate story about what's going on. A lot of the theology of the New Testament was kind of read into Christ's life after the fact. Mark is the earliest gospel, and it comes 40 years after the life of Christ. There are a lot of dynamics going on with the Old Testament that show that it cannot be relied upon either as an inspired, divinely inspired, infallible, inerrant text. And I'll be going through a number of books to show just, we're not going to dryly go through the books, in the sense of me just sitting there reading them. I'm going to try to distill the most important, observations and where biblical scholarship is at right now, and try to summarize in an effective and in an interesting way, in a way that you'll enjoy hearing, enjoy listening to, and glean a lot of insight from. I'll do that. I'll be using Bart Ehrman and a number of other sources. And one of the things I'm going to be doing, I'll be reading a book by Joel Baden from Yale University, who goes over the Old Testament, all the problems with the Old Testament. I'll be looking at Bart Ehrman and his insights on the New Testament. We'll be covering the two powers in heaven understanding, which is the idea that the angel of the Lord, far be it from being a theophany of the second member of the Holy Trinity, as Christians like to claim, was actually just a form of God, a form of Yahweh in the understanding of the Jews. And that position was most eloquently and most fully developed by Philo in the 1st century CE. I believe it was the 1st century CE. Yeah, no. It might have been just before. Anyway, I'm getting my dates just slightly off. But anyway, Philo provides some very interesting material for consideration. And but I'm going to be going a lot. I'll be starting a lot further back from Philo to talk about some of the things that caused the rabbis to respond to errors that were cropping up long before Christ, and kind of show how this idea developed over time. And I think that this is what ultimately influenced Paul's theology. I don't think Paul had anything remotely close to a Trinitarian understanding as we understand it through the lenses of, the First Council of Nicaea, or even people like Irenaeus or Justin Martyr, or some of those earlier church fathers. Okay, that does it for this installment, and hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you soon again.